My name is Kurt Miner. I'm the Senior History Curator here at the State Museum of Pennsylvania. Also the curator of this exhibit. It's titled, Why Not in Pennsylvania? Campaigning for Women's Suffrage in the Keystone State, 1910 to 1920. This exhibit examines Pennsylvania's role in the broader national story of the 19th Amendment, which is being commemorated this year in 2020, 100th anniversary of that particular amendment, which gave women the right to vote. This exhibit is designed to tell Pennsylvania's story. The story begins in the 19th century, but really begins to pick up speed in the early 1900s when women across Pennsylvania began campaigning in earnest for the vote. This photograph that opens our exhibit shows a group of women standing outside the Hotel Casey in downtown Scranton about 1914. If you notice, they're holding a banner, Votes for Women, which was effectively the brand for the women's movement, especially in the 1910s, when the focus was on, of course, very simply getting votes for women. In addition to this photograph, which I think really shows you the range of women now involved in the women's movement during this critical period leading up to the 19th Amendment, we also have an original banner, also Votes for Women, that was donated to the State Museum in about 1960 by a woman who was the president of the Dauphin County Women's Suffrage Association. The campaign for women's votes depended on a very strong organizational structure of women of all ages who joined in to campaign for this particular amendment. Although the campaign to win women's votes begins in the 19th century, it's not really until the early 1900s that the effort really begins to pick up speed. And that's because by the early 1900s, women are beginning to win the vote, but only at the state level and only in the great American West. By about 1910 or so, there's a sense that the movement is beginning to change and it has new energy and new life. That's reflected in the fact that women's organizations suddenly are increasing membership. And there's a real sense that they're at the cusp of some kind of major change that will happen at the state level, including here in Pennsylvania. As the movement began picking up strength, it really relied heavily on new organizations that were able to tap into the energies, especially of younger women. Organizations like the National College Equal Suffrage League, there was a Bryn Mawr chapter, Bryn Mawr in Philadelphia, of course. The Allegheny County Equal Rights Association, as another example, that's founded in 1904. And a national leadership that, interestingly enough, is based in Pennsylvania. Anna Howard Shaw directed the National American Women's Suffrage Association from her home in Delaware County. A key component of the women's suffrage movement, especially in the 1910s, was literally spreading the word. And the word, which was Votes for Women, was spread on every conceivable media. You saw Votes for Women on buttons, on playing cards, on handbills, and it was really part of an effort to saturate the streets and the cities and small towns with this highly visual message of Votes for Women. It was important that this message, Votes for Women, reached the entire state. And one of the more interesting ways that women figured out to do this was getting together campaign literature, packing it up into the trunk of a car and driving around the entire state. In the early 1910s, the Pennsylvania Women's Suffrage Association hired a woman named Lillian Stevens Howard as the grassroots organizer for the campaign. And over the course of about 3 months in the summer of 1913 and again in the summer of 1914, she drove around the state in a private automobile and visited small towns and big cities alike in order to sort of measure the strength of the movement and try to inject new life into it wherever she thought it was needed. Another common sight in the women's suffrage campaign during the 1910s were suffrage parades. There were, during those early years of the 1910s, many smaller parades that were taking place in places like Bellefonte and Center County and across the state. All of that was designed, again, to keep the movement in front and center for Pennsylvania residents who would soon be voting on the statewide referendum. The leadership of the women's movement in Pennsylvania, like the leadership of the national movement, was dominated by women who were generally affluent, generally college educated, and generally white. At the same time, however, there was an effort to, as we would say, broaden the tent to include women of color, people like Daisy Lampkin, who was a suffrage worker based in Pittsburgh, people like Rose Winslow, who was a former factory worker who was advocating on behalf of the women's vote, and people like Lavinia Lloyd Dock, who was a professional nurse and believed that getting the right to vote for working class women was as important as it was for middle class and upper class women. So in 1915, Pennsylvania defeats the statewide referendum. That really begins to shift the movement away from trying to win the vote through a constitutional amendment at the state level to gaining the vote through a constitutional amendment at the federal level. Beginning in 1917, the National Women's Party begins organizing parades and marches and protests, ultimately focusing their efforts on Washington, D.C. Pennsylvania, probably largely because of its proximity to Washington, D.C., plays a disproportionate role in those marches and in those pickets. I'm looking here at a photograph of the Pennsylvania delegation that was sent to Washington, D.C. in 1917 as they were preparing to picket the White House. It was the picketing of the White House in those early months of 1917 that really begins to change the tide of public opinion on women's suffrage. Women organized, it's important to note, the first peaceful protest at the White House. It was through the suffrage movement. By summer and early fall of 1917, peaceful protests were being met by resistance from local police, and famously in November of 1917, a number of pickets were arrested and imprisoned. Among those pickets were a number of prominent women from Pennsylvania, including women like Dora Lewis, who was a very politically well-connected society woman from Pennsylvania, who nonetheless was a strong ally of Alice Paul and was fully believed in her more direct confrontational tactics. She is arrested in November 1970, sent to prison, and proceeds to go on a hunger strike, along with, again, another group of Pennsylvania suffragists who had also been arrested. As part of one of the more interesting components of this exhibit is a notebook that we have from a woman, her name was Elizabeth McShane, who was among those arrested, imprisoned, and kept, interestingly enough, a prison diary while in the Occoquan workhouse that described her treatment there, which ultimately led to her hunger strike and then a forced feeding. The forced feeding of these women in the hunger strike in late 1917 seemed to be the tipping point. After this, public opinion again turned in favor of suffrage. Woodrow Wilson himself, who was tepid toward the movement, endorses it. That leads ultimately to the introduction of the 19th Amendment in Congress, which passes in June of 1919 and goes out to the states for ratification. I think it's interesting to note that when the 19th Amendment goes out to the states for ratification, Pennsylvania becomes the seventh state to ratify relatively early on. It's interesting because to think that 4 years earlier had defeated a statewide referendum. So clearly the movement had shifted. The 19th Amendment becomes a law of the land. The replica Liberty Bell, which had been silenced to symbolize the fact that women's voices were silenced, was rung in a very important ceremony in September of 1920. And then most importantly, after the official ratification of the 19th Amendment, in November of 1920, women in Pennsylvania, including in Pittsburgh, as shown in this photograph, were able to cast ballots in elections for the very first time. This exhibit showcases the important role which Pennsylvania played in the struggle to win women the rights to vote, which was ultimately culminated in the 19th Amendment in 1920. Our exhibit, Why Not in Pennsylvania? Campaigning for Women's Suffrage in the Keystone State, is open until the end of this year.